B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Thursday, April 4th, 2019. Pushback coming from members of Robert Mueller's investigative team at the special counsel's office. And based on leaks and leaked hearsay, the New York Times and the Washington Post reprise the role of the last few years. Tag team reporting that amplifies certain leaked information or commentary to promote a certain narrative. And so I understand how members of the Mueller team must feel to see their some 390, 400-page report reduced to a couple of partial quotes in a misleading summary prepared by the uber-partisan, recently appointed Attorney General Bill Barr. And particularly when it comes to the second part of the report related to alleged obstruction of justice, I can understand how they feel. And it's fascinating to see the coverage in the corporate media as they declare that the Mueller team that was leak-proof throughout its 20-plus months of existence has now been forced to use leaks to pressure Bill Barr to release the report. Now, first of all, when it comes to the part of the report related to alleged collusion or conspiracy, I think even without seeing whatever they're going to release to the public, we know that Mueller didn't find enough information to indict any of the people he investigated for conspiring with the Russians to tilt the election. Now, to the second part of the report about obstruction, I read to you yesterday a criticism I got, friendly criticism, from listener Robert Blumen, that I have a case of Trump derangement syndrome because I think there is established collusion in the Michael Cohen plea deals amplified by his congressional testimony. And I hold out the possibility that Robert Mueller either described Trump as an unindicted co-conspirator or there's some discussion of that in his report. Of course, we don't know because it's been pocketed by Bill Barr, who is benefiting from getting his spun-up version of the report, mischaracterized probably, out in the public domain. And I'm not at all shocked or surprised by this. It's exactly why Trump put Bill Barr in there. And it's why Bob Mueller, who is not a independent counsel. He is a special counsel who works under the Attorney General. This was the inevitable result of this process. Rachel Maddow and those who've been stoking the Trump-Russia narrative have made it out that Bob Mueller was going to save the day. But this process was defective from the get-go. And my big question is, I look at this coverage, and we learn, we get, I guess, additional information that Robert Mueller did not make a recommendation. He, quote, made no judgment on the obstruction matter. And this enabled Bill Barr to step in, fill that vacuum, and declare that he and Rod Rosenstein had decided that there was either insufficient basis or something else that made it impossible to pursue obstruction charges. Now, as I've said, I believe that this really is the purview of Congress. And it's possible that Mueller wrote his report leaning toward claims of obstruction, but barred and blocked from indicting a sitting president. He just kind of left it laying there. Now, there's another theory I'll offer, and that is that Bob Mueller was passive-aggressive and that he played a double game. He told his investigators, dig it all up, lay it all out. And then with his friend of 30 years, Bill Barr, he teed it up so that Barr could make that decision and produce what Trump calls his exoneration. Now, I clearly don't believe Trump's claims of exoneration. But this is a little sordid for the leak-proof Mueller team to suddenly decide it's leaking time, not Mueller time. And so we have to watch the clock run, as Barr has suggested that sometime around tax day, the middle of the month, the report will be released. Now, the tag team coverage at the Washington Post includes actual quotes from the unnamed leakers. Here's one. "It was much more acute than Barr suggested," said one person who, like others, spoke on the condition of anonymity because of the subject's sensitivity. Members of Mueller's team have complained to close associates that the evidence they gathered on obstruction was alarming and significant. So that's the hearsay claim that I'm characterizing here, because the members of Mueller's team are not speaking and identifying themselves. They're not allowing themselves to be quoted by name. And so they told some friends, well, you go ahead and leak this to the Post or the Times. And I treat that just as all of the leaks that propelled the Trump-Russia narrative in the corporate media did over these past 2 to 3 years. Here's another quote from a U.S. official briefed on the matter. Who could that be? "There was immediate displeasure from the team when they saw how the Attorney General had characterized their work." The same official, apparently, said that summaries were prepared for different sections of the report with a view that they could be made public. It was prepared so that, quote, "the front matter from each section could have been released immediately or very quickly," the same unnamed official said. "It was done in a way that minimum redactions, if any, would be necessary." Another unnamed person familiar with the matter disputed that characterization, saying the summaries contained sensitive information that will likely require redaction. So this is a game. And it's being played by people who we cannot identify. And we have to be skeptical, not only of Bill Barr and his motives, that's pretty clear, but St. Bob Mueller, what are his motives? And is he kind of insulating himself from his angry prosecutors by making Bill Barr the fall guy for the spinning and kind of dismembering of the work that is reflected in that report? Then Aaron Blake, with opinion from the Post, writes, "For the entirety of its probe, Special Counsel Mueller's team has been leak-proof. But now we are getting leaks that Mueller's team, members of the team, were grousing about how Bill Barr has handled his summarizing of the report." And I'm quoting now, "Even if these leaks weren't deliberate," the Times initially reported this secondhand, "the fact that the investigators are complaining enough that this would leak is significant. So just like Rachel Maddow and the people who haven't given up at MSDNC, they're trying to lead their followers into believing that there are stunning negative findings in the Mueller investigation report. And I think most people will be let down when whatever we get is released." Yesterday, the chair of the House Ways and Means Committee, Massachusetts Democrat Richard Neal, wrote a letter to the IRS exercising his authority to request copies of Trump's tax returns. Once again, I think a lot of people believe, oh, we're going to see Trump's tax returns. Maybe some of this will leak. Maybe all of it will leak. But I, for one, am uncomfortable setting a precedent to have one party grab the tax returns of the president of another party, even as odious as Trump is, even as corrupt as he is, and the tax returns might give us useful information. I hope they do keep it confidential and maybe use it for the basis of further investigations or that impeachment proceeding that I still have daydreams about. The bluffer-in-chief has done it again. First it was Republicans are going to come up with a beautiful health care package, and then, oh no, not till after the 2020 election. And today he backed down from his threat to close the southern border this week, issuing a warning to Mexico that they've got a year to do whatever it is he's demanded, and of course that changes every day. Quote, we're going to give them a 1-year warning, and if the drugs don't stop or largely stop, we're going to put tariffs on Mexico and products, particularly cars. And if that doesn't stop the drugs, we close the border. Now, he's reacting to pressure from mostly Republicans and business leaders that closing the border is a really bad idea. I mean, already there's been a strike by Mexican auto workers that is generally not covered in the corporate media in this country. But it has affected the supply chain for Detroit, and they've had to either cut shifts or shut down plants entirely. And so to cut off arbitrarily transit of products through the border as you try to implement your racist policy of keeping people from coming through the border? Well, Trump is going to Calexico here in California to visit a portion of the wall that they say has already been built. And, of course, this is a fabrication because there was funding left over from the Obama years for a partial barrier near Calexico. So he's going to go down there and get a hard-on in front of a piece of wall, I guess. I don't really know. Responding to this week's Supreme Court decision to put a stay on the execution of a man in Texas because his Buddhist spiritual advisor was not allowed into the death chamber, while Christian and Muslim advisors have been for other executions. Well, the Texas Department of Criminal Justice just decided that when they zap somebody, they're not going to allow any religious counselor to be present. And this just shows how bloodthirsty they are and how Texas is bent on maintaining its bizarre status as the #1 state for executions in this country. I want to recommend the latest post by Kevin Gostola over at Shadowproof. He took a good read of the Supreme Court decision last week in the case of Russell Bucklew. He's the guy from Missouri who has cancer, including in his throat and in his mouth, and his lawyers argue, competently, that if they inject lethal drugs, that those tumors filled with blood vessels will explode, and that this will cause him to suffocate on his own blood for several minutes before he actually expires. And that doesn't bother Neil Gorsuch, who wrote the majority opinion, saying that Missouri can execute him anyway. And Justice Breyer, in the dissent, wrote, in my view, that holding violates the clear command of the Eighth Amendment. Gorsuch says the Eighth Amendment forbids cruel and unusual methods of capital punishment, but does not guarantee a painless death. And Gorsuch, showing just how callous he can be, went on. As originally understood, the Eighth Amendment tolerated methods of execution like hanging that involved a significant risk of pain, while forbidding as cruel only those methods that intensified the death sentence by super-adding terror, pain, or disgrace. And I'd love to get somebody to check his temperature. He seems to be reptilian. And so Gostola does a good job of reviewing the arguments presented in both the majority opinion and in the dissent by Justice Breyer. And here's a quote he uses from a Harvard Law graduate, executive editor of Above the Law, Elie Mystal. Quote, unknown numbers of innocent people have been executed in this country since the death penalty was reinstated. Untold numbers of guilty people have known the spiteful vengeance some people mistake for justice. Through it all, the Eighth Amendment sits on the sidelines, a grand idea neutered by our society's rage and cowardice, waiting for better men and women to live up to its noble promise. And I'm surprised, but this is the second time this week I'm quoting from USA Today. I rarely pick up that rag, and they run such short coverage of even important stories that I find it frustrating. But here's a piece that's long by USA Today standards, printed out with a few ads in the way. It runs 9 pages. Headline: Wrongful convictions are disturbingly common, and prosecutors have duty to fix injustice. Now, I've linked to this report and invite you to read it. They focus on 2 people, Huey Burton, who was wrongfully convicted at the age of 16 based on false confessions, and Gloria Killian, a 35-year-old law student with no criminal history, falsely accused of orchestrating a deadly burglary, and she was falsely accused of being the mastermind of the case. And in both cases, the prosecutors sat on what's called exculpatory evidence, evidence they knew would benefit the accused, and they allowed them to be convicted and serve long stretches in prison without revealing that information that would have overturned the conviction. And USA Today notes that research tells us that more than half of wrongful convictions involve questionable forensic science testimony, including experts overstating their conclusions or testifying with more certainty than warranted, and that is the drive of a district attorney to convict at all costs. Now there are conviction integrity units. One's been set up in Florida. And considering that more than 2,400 people have been exonerated since 1989, and between 1973 and 2018, 164 people were exonerated from death row, well, we need more of what they call these CIUs, Conviction Integrity Units. And we need to bust some bad prosecutors for their dereliction of duty and the cost that they've imposed on wrongfully convicted individuals. Now, I first thought this was a joke. Remember 2012 Republican candidate Herman Cain? The guy who didn't know the name of Uzbekistan, and his economic policy was simple enough for morons? 999. I don't remember what the 9 stood for, but I can remember Herman Cain saying 999. Well, Trump is going to appoint him to the Federal Reserve 7-member governing board. Now, unlike the other guy who is currently fighting to get confirmed, Stephen Moore, Herman Cain actually has some experience. He was a director of the Federal Reserve in Kansas City for 4 years during the Clinton administration. I think he's an idiot, but this is what we get. And get this, Mitch McConnell has now put together a plan to fast-track confirmations in the Senate. And it appears that this won't help Stephen Moore or Mr. 999. But in the future, they have reduced the requirement for 30 hours of debate on a nominee to 2 hours. Now, this is mostly for appointees to the federal bench, the trial courts, the U.S. district courts. It was rammed through on a 51-48 vote with Republicans Susan Collins and Mike Lee voting with the Democrats. And this is going to enable massive court packing with young, white, conservative judges who will be there for 30 to 50 years. It's going to be pretty devastating. Every day I pause for a moment to thank the people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast with your subscriptions. Let's see who's going to get mentioned today. Catherine Hemness just renewed an annual subscription. Marvin Rasmussen, Paul Karsh, and Abby McMillan. They each kick in a monthly amount. You can do it too. All you have to do is visit peterbcollins.com. You click on the menu tab, then pull on Become a Subscriber. You land on the sign-up page, and boom, you can choose a level of support that's comfortable for you. I've got bonus books if you take out a new annual subscription for $50 and give me a mailing address in the continental U.S. The books are Trump on the Couch by Dr. Justin Frank and 2100. That is the book about climate change, which with actual blueprints for human adaptation to avoid extinction. And if you want to communicate with me by the U.S. mail, my post office box is number 150-660, San Rafael, California, 94915. Well, the House passed a bill despite vigorous opposition from the NRA, and the vote wasn't close, 263 to 158, for a renewal and expansion of the Violence Against Women Act. And the provisions tighten what was called the boyfriend loophole, and essentially it bars those who've been convicted of domestic violence-related crimes from purchasing a gun. Now, I think that this is well-intentioned. It's a decent piece of legislation, but there's going to be a big battle in the Senate where California's very senior senator, Dianne Feinstein, is teaming up with Joni Ernst, the pig wrestler from Iowa, to try to get it through. I frankly don't think the votes are there in the Senate. Because of the large field of presidential candidates, the Democratic National Committee has set up a new program that essentially is a pay-to-play plan. And I decided that I was going to invest $5 in trying to get some of the interesting candidates who are advancing some positions that I support onto the debate stage. So the other night I went on to Act Blue and only took a few minutes, and I donated $1 to Tulsi Gabbard of Hawaii. I support her positions on ending regime change wars. Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts. I support her domestic economic policies and regulating the tech companies. Governor Jay Inslee of Washington. I support his focus on climate change. And let me remember who else was on my list. There was one more. Oh, I don't have the list in front of me. Warren. Oh, Castro, Julian Castro of Texas, because of his very compassionate positions on immigration. So these are not endorsements. These are my wish that they appear on the debate stage, and I had to pay $1 each to buy them a ticket. Each of them needs 65,000 donors of $1 or more, and I think they have to be divided up. There's some metric on how many states the money has to come from. So I encourage you to advance the interest of your favorite candidate because the field is getting larger. Across the bay from me is the district of Eric Swalwell, Democrat, who has served 4 terms, and he's been angling to run for president. He thought he was going to do it on the Russiagate issues, but he has now pivoted and announced that next week he'll go on the Stephen Colbert Late Show and announce he's running for president on gun control. Now, his ambition is not a secret in Washington. One of his Democratic colleagues joked to me that Eric Swalwell's entire staff are media bookers. They don't worry about policy issues or constituent service. Their job was to get Eric Swalwell on Rachel Maddow's program. And he and Adam Schiff were kind of the 2 most frequent guests promoting Russiagate. I don't see much mileage ahead for Eric Swalwell, and at some point he would have to give up his congressional seat to continue running. But I welcome all entrants to the race. Or do I? Tim Ryan of Ohio, the conservative, who has he did once challenge Nancy Pelosi for the leadership position of the Democrats in the House. He is a pro-labor but very conservative Democrat, and he is going to hold a rally in Youngstown to announce his presidential candidacy on Saturday. And Joe Biden, who would be the 19th candidate in the race if he does actually go forward, he issued a statement yesterday, and let me quote from it, because I felt he was sincere and heartfelt. Quote, "I've never thought of politics as cold and antiseptic. I've always thought it was about connecting with people, like I've said, shaking hands, hands on the shoulder, a hug, encouragement. Now it's all about taking selfies together. Social norms have begun to change. They've shifted, and the boundaries of protecting personal space have been reset, and I get it. I hear what they're saying, I understand it, and I'll be more mindful. That's my responsibility, and I'll meet it." One more quote from Uncle Joe. "I'll always believe governing, quite frankly, life for that matter, is about connecting with people. That won't change. But I will be more mindful and respectful of people's personal space." Well, he didn't exactly apologize, and I think it's pretty clear. that Joe Biden's time has come and gone. And this was a stumble that I think accentuated that. We'll see if I'm right. Meanwhile, in London, by a single vote, the House of Commons forced through in 6 hours an emergency bill to instruct Theresa May to seek an extension to Article 50 and avoid a no-deal Brexit. Now, I don't know how she can get an extension. I used extinction there, and you can laugh at that. Because the European Union has repeatedly rebuffed efforts for an extension. So we'll see where all this goes. And the woman who provided the final vote, let's see what her name is here, Fiona Anasanya, who left the Labour Party. She's now independent. She voted in favor of the bill, and Brexiters then attacked her, saying that she should have abstained because she was recently jailed for repeatedly lying to avoid a speeding ticket. Okay. And then another section of the House of Commons, during a hearing, developed a leak, which is unfortunately a metaphor for the conditions in Britannia today. New memo from the Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, directed to the President, subject avoiding war with Russia over Venezuela. And I've linked to this so you can read it for yourselves. I support the notion of this warning offered by VIPS, but I argue with the language, quote, President Maduro's mishandling of the economy and authoritarian reactions to provocations are impossible to defend, but they result in part from the fact that he's been under siege since he was first elected in 2013 and has faced sanctions aimed ultimately at removing him from office. Now, some of this may be posturing on the part of VIPS, hoping to get the president's sympathetic ear. But he doesn't have one. And so they don't challenge the claims that the election was illegitimate. They don't challenge that the promotion of Guaido was not constitutional. They do comment on the fact that the military in Venezuela has not separated from Maduro. And they basically advise the president that the opportunity for regime change has come and gone. But I don't embrace some of the arguments that they advance in support of their cause. Now, this is not related to parts from Mexico or the issues that I talked about earlier related to the auto industry. But a good piece the other day in the Los Angeles Times explained how the United Auto Workers got on their knees, both of them. They gave General Motors every concession that was asked for, worth $118 million, trying to keep the Lordstown plant producing the Chevy Cruze open and operating. And after those concessions, GM responded by cutting the third shift. Then they cut the second shift. And now they have shut down the entire plant. Now they're saying it's because of sluggish sales of the Cruze. It's not because of labor issues. But the UAW points out that of the 38 models that GM sells in the United States, only 5 do more volume than the Cruze. I actually had a Cruze while my car was being worked on recently. It was pretty nice. I thought it was an okay car. So now there are 1,400 workers who are filing for unemployment. And despite the super competitive operating agreement, which they submitted to, General Motors is going to shut that plant down. Now, Trump has publicly tweaked GM about that. But he has caused great pain for the auto industry because of the trade war. And as I mentioned earlier, they've had to cut shifts and shut down some plants because they can't get the parts they need that are made in Mexico. And Trump appears oblivious to that. He doesn't recognize that the vast majority, for example, of BMWs sold in the United States are made in the great German city of Spartanburg, South Carolina. And finally today, a judge in Massachusetts has accepted the necessity defense and dismissed cases against dozens of protesters who had stopped the construction of a pipeline in West Roxbury, Massachusetts. Now, they were arrested back in 2015. The most prominent member of the defendant pool is Corinna Gore, daughter of the former vice president. And they presented the necessity defense based on climate change. So, in the first wave of people who were tried, Judge Mary Ann Driscoll found all 13 defendants not responsible. And she did so after the defendants each individually addressed the judge and explained why they were driven to try to halt the pipeline's construction. I'm encouraged by this. The valve turners, who we interviewed last year, they were permitted to use the necessity defense in some of the courtroom proceedings that followed their heroic act. And I hope that this sets a precedent that we'll see more of. Thanks for joining me today for my news and comment podcast. You are free to share it far and wide. You'll find it on YouTube. And I'm still Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling